"You are nothing but a lowly grunt who spent almost a decade living off my son," Eleanor said. The microphone feedback whined, piercing the thick air of my living room, which smelled heavily of funeral lilies and stale coffee. 200 guests filled the first floor, spilling from the living room into the dining room, the foyer, and the covered patio. All of them went dead silent. Someone in the back dropped a silver spoon against a china plate, and the clatter rang out like a gunshot. My fingers pressed hard into the mahogany table, the cold wood biting into my skin right next to the folded flag they had just handed me at the cemetery. 38 years old, Nora, my mother-in-law continued, her voice dripping with that practiced Southern pity she reserved for the country club staff. And still just the enlisted charity case Adam took pity on. "You do not belong in this family. You never did. And now that he is gone, you do not belong in this house." I did not scream, and I did not cry. My jaw ached from grinding my teeth all morning, but I kept my face perfectly still. Adam had warned me about this exact moment 3 weeks before his heart gave out at the age of 43. He told me his parents would use his funeral to take everything. Eleanor marched across the Persian rug and slapped a thick manila folder onto the coffee table. The paper crinkled sharply, and she smoothed her black mourning dress with manicured hands. "Adam signed this property transfer to us before he passed," the woman who had ignored my existence for 8 years announced to the crowd. "He wanted the Whitaker family home to stay with blood. I expect you out by the end of the weekend." I looked down at the folder. Dozens of military wives, Adam's former colleagues, and neighbors stared at me, waiting for me to break. I picked up my water glass instead, the condensation freezing against my palm, and took a slow sip. "Is that the original?" I asked. My voice came out barely above a whisper, forcing the entire room to lean in. Eleanor lifted her chin. She thought she had won, and she assumed my silence was fear, just like she assumed my civilian clothes meant I was still the struggling private she met a decade ago. My in-laws never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living, and Adam kept it quiet to protect me. To them, Nora Hayes Whitaker was just a stray. "Of course it is the original," Charles said. My father-in-law stepped out from the shadow of the staircase. He let out a dry, harsh laugh that carried the faint scent of scotch. "This house is ours now. Who will you rely on now, Nora?" I opened my mouth to answer, but a low, heavy rumble rattled the front windows. The crystal chandelier above us swayed. It was not a single engine, but a fleet. Guests pressed against the bay windows, pulling back the sheer curtains. Whispers erupted across the room. I did not need to look outside to know what was parking on my street. 3 vehicles pulled directly into the wide driveway, including a government sport utility vehicle, a massive cargo truck, and a command van. I knew the staging plan. 7 other support vehicles were parking along the curb and the community center lot a block away, completing an approved transfer mission. Heavy boots thumped against the front porch steps. The solid oak door swung open, and the autumn wind rushed in, scattering a stack of sympathy cards across the entryway table. Major Leah Morgan stepped inside. She wore her dress uniform, her boots polished to a mirror shine, flanked by 2 uniformed soldiers carrying a metal lockbox. Leah did not look at Eleanor. She ignored Charles. Her eyes scanned the crowd, found me standing by the fireplace, and she walked straight through the sea of terrified guests. She stopped exactly 3 feet away from me, snapped to attention, raised her right hand in a flawless, razor-sharp salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker," Leah announced, her voice carrying the unmistakable weight of a junior officer reporting to her commander. "The convoy is ready for your orders." The silence in the room turned into an absolute vacuum. I watched Charles grip the banister, his knuckles turning white. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again, but no sound came out. The mask of the powerful family matriarch shattered right there on my rug. I was not a lowly grunt, because I commanded a civil affairs battalion, and these soldiers reported directly to me. I returned Leah's salute, slowly lowering my hand to my side. "Stand by, Major," I said. Then I turned my attention back to the woman clutching the microphone. "You were saying, Eleanor?" My mother-in-law stared at the soldiers, then back at me, her chest heaving. Leah stepped forward, placing the heavy metal box on the table right next to Eleanor's folder. A red tamper evidence seal locked the latch, stamped with bold black letters reading Box Number 7. Leah looked down at the manila folder, her expression turning to stone. "Ma'am," she said, addressing me but keeping her eyes locked on Eleanor. "If that is the property transfer Colonel Whitaker warned us about, we need everyone to step away from the table immediately." Eleanor recoiled from the table, but the shock only held her for a few seconds. The woman had spent a lifetime perfecting her victim routine, and she slipped back into it with terrifying speed. "This is a misunderstanding," my mother-in-law announced to the silent room. Tears pooled in her eyes, welling up right on cue. "Major Morgan is simply paying respects to my son. Adam was a beloved commander, and this is his funeral." She dabbed her cheeks with a black lace handkerchief. The older woman turned toward the crowd of neighbors and military wives, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "My son is dead, and she brought soldiers to intimidate his grieving parents," Eleanor sobbed. A low murmur rippled through the 200 guests. Some of them looked at the armed soldiers, then back at me, their faces caught between confusion and pity. Charles stepped forward, placing a protective arm around his wife's shoulders. "You have made your little scene, Nora," my father-in-law said, puffing out his chest. "Now call off your dogs and let these good people go home. You can pack your bags in the morning." I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask a single guest to leave. "Nobody needs to go anywhere," I said, my tone completely even. "If you want to claim my home in front of our friends and family, then I want every single person in this room to see exactly how you do it." The silence thickened. Nobody moved toward the front door. A woman in a tailored gray suit stepped out from the back of the crowd. Grace Holloway had been standing quietly near the kitchen for the last 2 hours, blending in with the mourners just as I had asked her to do. "Excuse me," Grace said, her voice cutting through the tension with clinical precision. She walked to the coffee table and set her leather briefcase down next to the military lockbox. Eleanor glared at the newcomer. "Who are you? Another one of her military thugs?" "I am a civilian attorney, Mrs. Whitaker," Grace replied smoothly. "I do not represent the United States Army, but I do represent your daughter-in-law in matters regarding property and estate law." Grace popped the brass latches on her briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed in the quiet room. She pulled out a stack of crisp, watermarked pages and laid them out on the mahogany wood. "This is the county deed and the escrow closing statement for this property," the lawyer explained, tapping the top page. "These documents show that Nora Hayes Whitaker is the sole legal owner." Eleanor scoffed, a bitter sound that ruined her grieving mother act. "Adam was a colonel. He made excellent money. My son bought this house and you know it." Grace did not argue, and she did not raise her voice. She simply placed another piece of paper on top of the stack. "This is a bank wire transfer record from 8 years ago," Grace said. "It proves that the entire down payment for this house came from the sale of a condominium that my client owned before she ever met your son. Not a single cent of Whitaker family money was used to purchase this property." Charles shifted his weight, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. The freeloader narrative was dissolving right in front of him, and he knew the crowd was watching it happen. "Furthermore," Grace continued, pulling a thick blue binder from her case, "this house is currently in the final stages of being transferred into an irrevocable trust, the Adam Whitaker Family Recovery House." I swallowed hard, feeling a familiar tightness in my throat. Adam and I had spent our evenings planning this over weak hospital coffee. My husband and I intended to use this property as a transitional home for wounded veterans and their families, I told the crowd. It was his dying wish to build something that helped people heal. He never intended for his parents to sell it for profit. Eleanor's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. She snatched the manila folder off the table, her manicured nails digging into the paper. "You are lying," the matriarch spat, waving her document in the air. "I have the transfer right here. Adam gave this property to us. He signed it." I took a slow breath. I did not reach for the folder, and I made sure my hands stayed firmly at my sides. "Show it to the attorney, Eleanor," I said quietly. Grace adjusted her glasses. "Yes, Mrs. Whitaker. If you are producing an original legal document to claim this property, I need you to place it on the table so I can examine it in front of these witnesses." Eleanor slammed the paper down next to the military lockbox, completely unaware that she had just triggered the trap Adam left behind. Grace leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the ink. I watched the lawyer trace her finger down to the bottom of the page, right where the notary stamp sat. "This says Adam signed this transfer at home at 7:30 on the evening of March 17th, Grace said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. She looked up from the paper, meeting my eyes. "He was sedated in the hospital at 6, I replied, and watched all the color drain out of Charles Whitaker's face. The silence following my hospital revelation hung in the air like thick smoke. Charles lost the color in his cheeks, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands dropped loosely to his sides. Eleanor, however, possessed an entirely different kind of survival instinct. The matriarch did not retreat when cornered, and she simply changed the battlefield. "What kind of wife hides her rank from her husband's family?" Eleanor demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. She turned toward the crowd of mourners, gesturing wildly toward my simple black dress. For 8 years, she sat at my dinner table, playing the poor, struggling, enlisted girl. She lied to us. She lied to Adam. I watched her weave the narrative, spinning my silence into a web of deceit. My jaw tightened, and a familiar ache radiated through my temples. The truth was far heavier than any lie, because I had never hidden anything. They just chose to stay blind. 10 years ago, on a sweltering afternoon in July, Eleanor met me for the very first time. I was wearing my enlisted uniform, standing in the driveway with grease on my hands from fixing a busted radiator. The older woman took one look at my bruised knuckles, sniffed the air as if I carried a contagious disease, and permanently filed me away as a lowly grunt. Nothing I did after that day ever updated her mental ledger, because updating her worldview would require her to admit I had value. Adam understood the danger of his parents' obsession with status, and he made a deliberate choice to shield my career from their grasping hands. We sat in our kitchen a week after our wedding, drinking cheap wine while he held my hands across the small table. He asked me to keep my professional life separate, to serve under the name Nora Hayes or Nora Hayes Whitaker, and to leave my uniform at the base. If Eleanor and Charles knew I was climbing the ranks, they would have paraded me around their country club as a trophy, leveraging my military authority for their own social currency. So, I wore modest floral dresses to Thanksgiving dinners, and I listened patiently while Charles lectured me about how the real world operated. He would swirl his expensive scotch and tell me that military folks only knew how to follow orders, not how to manage assets. Whenever I tried to talk about my battalion, Eleanor would loudly offer everyone more mashed potatoes, seamlessly talking over me until my voice faded into the background. When my promotion ceremony arrived, Adam invited them, but they claimed they were simply too busy with a weekend golf tournament to attend. "I did not hide my life from you," I said softly, pulling myself back to the present. The 200 guests leaned in closer, straining to catch every syllable. "You just never looked." Eleanor flinched, the words landing like a physical blow against her ribs. The absolute certainty in my voice left no room for debate, so she pivoted again, weaponizing her grief for the audience. "You brought an entire army to my son's funeral just to humiliate me," the older woman wept, pointing a trembling finger at Major Leah Morgan. "You are using government soldiers for a personal vendetta against a grieving family. I will have you court-martialed for this. Charles found his voice again, stepping forward with his chest puffed out. She is right. You cannot turn a private residence into a military occupation just because you are throwing a tantrum. I am calling the police right now. Leah did not even blink at the empty threat. The major reached into her own leather folio, pulling out a crisp white document bearing an official Department of Defense seal. She held it with absolute precision, the paper catching the light from the chandelier. There is no illegal occupation happening here, sir, Leah stated, her voice projecting clearly across the vast living room. This is an official memorial and transfer mission, approved and scheduled 3 weeks ago through the proper chain of command. Leah unfolded a logistical staging map, holding it up for the room to see. The document was covered in signatures, dates, and official stamps. The vehicle manifest clearly outlines our authorized presence, the officer explained, reading from the bold text. 10 vehicles were dispatched for this assignment. 2 cargo trucks carrying medical beds and wheelchair ramps, 2 government utility vehicles, 2 passenger vans, a maintenance pickup, a small support trailer, and 2 escort vehicles. Because this is a residential neighborhood, we executed a coordinated staging plan with local authorities. The major pointed a gloved finger toward the front windows. Only 3 vehicles entered the driveway to deliver the initial supplies. The remaining 7 are parked at the community center down the block, exactly as cleared by the county permits. We are not here to threaten anyone. We are here to deliver medical equipment for the Adam Whitaker Family Recovery House. The crowd murmured, the tide turning completely against my in-laws. The neighbors who had been quietly reaching for their phones slowly lowered their hands, realizing the military presence was a sanctioned act of charity, not a rogue display of power. A few of the military wives in the back row exchanged knowing looks, their expressions hardening as they glared at Eleanor. My mother-in-law realized her abuse of authority angle had crumbled to dust. She stared at the staging plan, her chest heaving beneath her black lace dress, and then she turned her tear-streaked face toward me. If my son truly wanted to turn his home into a charity ward, he would have told me. Eleanor sobbed, her voice cracking with genuine desperation. I am his mother. He told me everything. He would never leave me in the dark about something this important. I looked at the woman who had spent a decade treating me like a ghost in my own living room. She was so convinced of her own importance, so deeply anchored in the delusion that Adam belonged entirely to her, that she could not comprehend a world where he kept secrets to protect his wife. He did tell you, Eleanor, I replied, the quiet sadness in my tone slicing through her hysteria. You just never listened. I turned my gaze toward the coffee table, focusing on the heavy metal lockbox resting beside the forged deed. The red tamper evidence seal gleamed under the lights, a silent promise from a man who knew exactly how this awful day would unfold. Grace Holloway followed my gaze, her professional demeanor shifting into something much sharper. The attorney reached across the polished mahogany wood and gripped the plastic seal. Major Morgan, Grace said, looking up at the officer. The chain of custody has been verified. The condition for delivery has been met by the production of a disputed property transfer. I am breaking the seal on box number 7. Proceed, ma'am, Leah confirmed, stepping back and assuming a parade rest stance. The sharp snap of the thick plastic seal echoed through the dead, silent room. Grace lifted the heavy metal lid, the hinges groaning slightly under the weight, and reached inside. She bypassed a stack of thick legal files, pushing aside several sealed envelopes, and pulled out a small silver universal serial bus drive. A piece of white medical tape was wrapped around the metal casing. Black ink stained the tape, written in the shaky, exhausted handwriting of a dying man. Grace held the small device up, turning it so the bold letters faced the crowd of mourners. The words were impossible to misinterpret, and they sealed the fate of the 2 people standing across from me. It read, "For Nora, if my parents claim the house." My breath caught in my throat. the cold reality of Adam's foresight washing over me like ice water. He knew what they were capable of, and he loved me enough to leave a weapon behind. Eleanor stared at the small metal drive, her face completely entirely devoid of color, as Grace reached into her briefcase to retrieve a laptop. Grace Holloway held the small silver drive up for the entire room to see. The metal casing caught the light from the crystal chandelier, throwing a tiny glare across the Persian rug. 200 guests held their collective breath, waiting for the attorney to plug the device into the laptop resting on the coffee table. Instead, Grace lowered her hand and slipped the drive into the breast pocket of her tailored gray suit. "We will get to the video, Mrs. Whitaker," the lawyer said, turning her attention back to the frantic woman standing across from us. "But before we listen to what your son had to say, we need to take a very close look at the document you brought into this house." My mother-in-law blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden shift in strategy. She had braced herself for the digital recording, likely preparing another bout of theatrical tears, but Grace was not going to let her control the pacing of her own destruction. The attorney reached across the mahogany table and picked up the manila folder Eleanor had slammed down just minutes earlier. Grace opened the cover, sliding the single sheet of paper out with meticulous care. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of the thick parchment. "According to this transfer of deed," Grace announced, her voice projecting clearly to the military wives and neighbors gathered near the bay windows, "Adam Whitaker signed away his legal rights to this property on March 17th. Eleanor lifted her chin, recovering a fraction of her usual arrogance. "That is correct. It was a Tuesday. He wanted to make sure his affairs were in order before things got worse." "And the time of the signature?" Grace asked, tracing her finger along the bottom edge of the page. "The notary seal indicates this document was executed at exactly 7:30 in the evening." "Yes," Charles chimed in from the shadows of the staircase. My father-in-law crossed his arms over his chest, trying to project absolute authority. "I was there. We sat right here in the dining room. Adam wanted to do it at home, where he felt safe, surrounded by his real family." The lie hung in the air, thick and foul. Eleanor nodded emphatically, dabbing the corner of her eye with her black lace handkerchief. She was practically begging the crowd to believe the heartwarming image of a dying son making peace with his devoted parents in his childhood home. There was just one massive problem with their story, and a cold knot of anticipation tightened in my stomach as I reached into my own black leather tote bag. I knew exactly where my husband was at 7:30 on the 17th of March, and he certainly was not sitting at our dining room table. I pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from my bag. The pages bore the blue watermark of the county hospital network, crisp and undeniable. I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Grace, and placed the medical file directly on top of Eleanor's forged transfer. As Adam's wife and his legally designated medical proxy, I have full, unrestricted access to his patient portal, I told the silent room. My voice remained steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "These are the official, time-stamped medical logs from his final month." Eleanor stared at the hospital logo, the color draining from her cheeks so fast she looked physically ill. "Let us look at the entry for March 17th, Grace said, flipping open the heavy file. The attorney scanned the dense blocks of text, finding the exact line she needed. "According to the attending physician and the nursing staff on duty, Colonel Whitaker experienced a severe pain crisis late in the afternoon." The crowd shifted, a collective murmur of sympathy rippling through the guests. I hated putting Adam's pain on display, but his parents had forced my hand when they decided to use his death as a financial opportunity. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, Grace continued, her tone clinical and devastating, Adam was administered a heavy dose of intravenous sedative medication. He was confined to his bed in the palliative care wing of the county hospital. The chart notes specifically state that the patient was drifting in and out of consciousness and lacked the basic motor functions to hold a pen, let alone execute a complex legal document. Grace looked up, locking eyes with Charles. So, unless your son managed to escape a secure hospital ward while heavily sedated, drive himself home, sign a legal transfer at 7:30, and sneak back into his hospital bed without a single doctor noticing, your document is a physical impossibility. Charles erupted, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. The older man lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You forged that," my father-in-law shouted, the smell of stale scotch carrying on his breath. "You and your fancy lawyer printed out a bunch of fake medical jargon to steal our property. You are trying to confuse these people." Grace did not flinch. She simply tapped the top right corner of the medical record. "This is a direct, verified printout from the secure hospital database, sir," the attorney explained calmly. "It features a cryptographic digital timestamp directly from the network server. Falsifying this document would constitute a severe federal crime, which is exactly the charge you are currently facing by presenting that fraudulent deed." Charles opened his mouth to argue, but he had absolutely no ground left to stand on. The guests were no longer looking at my in-laws with pity, and the expressions in the room had shifted to disgust. Grace was not finished. A good lawyer never relies on just one piece of evidence when they can bury the opposition with two. She reached back into her briefcase and extracted a final sheet of paper, laying it next to the medical file. For a property transfer to be legally binding, the signature must be verified by a licensed notary public, Grace told the crowd, adopting the tone of a patient teacher explaining a simple concept to a difficult student. The notary is required by state law to maintain a strict, chronological logbook of every document they stamp. They must record the time, the location, and the identities of the witnesses present. Eleanor swallowed hard. The matriarch took a small step backward, bumping into the edge of the sofa. "During our preliminary legal review of your claim, my office requested a copy of the logbook belonging to the notary who stamped your deed," Grace said, tapping the new document. "The notary recorded the transaction, yes. But her official ledger states she notarized a signature for Adam Whitaker on March 16th, a full 24 hours before the date on your paper. Furthermore, she recorded the location as a coffee shop 3 towns over and listed a witness who was confirmed through flight records to be out of the state on that day." The silence in the living room was absolute. The deed was officially dirty, covered in inconsistencies and blatant lies. Eleanor and Charles had clearly bribed or pressured a sloppy notary to backdate a stamp on a forged signature, and they had bungled the details completely. The paperwork was more than enough to prove fraud in a courtroom, but a piece of paper could not adequately describe the sheer cruelty of what actually happened in that hospital room. We needed a human voice, and we needed someone who had seen their greed firsthand. A woman stepped out from the back row of mourners, pushing her way gently through the crowd of military wives. Elena Ramirez wore a modest navy blue dress, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun. She had been Adam's primary care nurse during his final weeks, and she had driven 2 hours just to attend the memorial service. "I was on shift that evening," the nurse said softly. Her voice lacked the booming projection of the attorney, but the acoustics of the quiet house carried her words perfectly. Eleanor whipped her head around, her eyes widening in genuine panic as she recognized the woman from the palliative care ward. "You need to leave," my mother-in-law hissed, completely dropping her grieving mother facade. "This is private, family business." Elena ignored the threat. The nurse walked up to stand beside me, offering a small, comforting nod before turning to face the crowd. Mrs. Whitaker arrived at the hospital shortly after 5 o'clock on March 17th. Elena told the room, her professional demeanor unshaken. She demanded to have private time with her son. When I informed her that the colonel was experiencing a severe pain episode and needed rest, she told me to get out of the room so she could talk some sense into him. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. A few people physically stepped away from Charles, putting distance between themselves and the man. "He was so incredibly weak," Elena continued, looking directly into Eleanor's panicked eyes. "But I did not trust the situation, so I left the hallway door cracked open by an inch. I heard you demanding that he sign a piece of paper to protect the family name. And I heard Colonel Whitaker tell you no. I heard him say very clearly that Nora keeps the house." The matriarch snapped. The polished country club exterior vanished entirely, replaced by something vicious and feral. "You are a liar," Eleanor screamed, her voice turning shrill and jagged. She pointed a shaking finger at the nurse. "You are nothing but a paid actor. Nora bought you off to come here and spout this absolute garbage. You are trash, and nobody in this room believes a single word you are saying." The vicious outburst sealed her fate. The guests stared in horror as the grieving mother revealed her true nature, an ugly, predatory thing that lashed out the moment it lost control. Elena held her ground against the screaming woman. The nurse did not raise her voice, but she stood a little taller, her hands folded neatly in front of her navy blue dress. "There was one more thing," the nurse said, waiting for Eleanor to stop shouting before delivering the final blow. "Colonel Whitaker knew his medication was making him tired, and he knew he could not fight you off forever, so he asked for my help." Eleanor froze, the breath catching in her throat. "He told me to take out my cellular phone," Elena revealed to the stunned crowd, "and he told me to record the room if his mother came back with papers." My mother-in-law stared at the nurse, her jaw trembling violently. "You had no right," Eleanor whispered. "You had no right." The phrase hung in the stagnant air of my living room, hissed through Eleanor's clenched teeth. Her polished veneer peeled away in real time, revealing the raw, unadulterated panic underneath. The older woman glared at the nurse, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. I stared at the black leather tote bag resting on the floor near Grace's feet. A heavy knot formed at the base of my throat, making it difficult to swallow. I did not want to turn my husband's memorial service into a public execution, and I knew Adam absolutely despised family scandals. He had spent his entire adult life keeping the peace, constantly absorbing his parents' toxic behavior so I would not have to deal with the fallout. But a memory surfaced, clear and sharp, cutting right through the overwhelming scent of funeral lilies. We were sitting in the palliative care ward 3 weeks ago, watching the autumn rain lash against the hospital window. Adam held my hand, his grip terrifyingly weak, and he made me promise him one specific thing. He told me not to protect his parents from the truth if they ever decided to attack me in his name. "Nurse Ramirez?" Grace said, breaking the suffocating silence. The attorney kept her voice perfectly level, anchoring the room with her calm professionalism. "You mentioned Colonel Whitaker asked you to record the room." Elena nodded, reaching into the deep pocket of her navy blue dress. She pulled out a standard smartphone, its screen cracked in the top right corner. "He did," the nurse confirmed. "The colonel knew his mother was trying to bypass his wishes, and he knew he lacked the physical strength to stop her. He asked me to document any attempts to coerce him." Grace turned toward the crowd of stunned mourners, making sure her next words were understood by everyone present. "I want to be completely clear. This is not a hidden camera placed illegally in a private residence. This is an audio file recorded on Colonel Whitaker's own phone, at his own request, while he was still alert enough to give consent. Nurse Ramirez witnessed that request and helped preserve the file after his death. We are presenting it strictly as witness support." Eleanor took a step backward, her expensive black heels sinking into the Persian rug. The matriarch looked like a trapped animal desperately searching for an exit, but 200 people blocked every possible path to the front door. "Play it," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Elena tapped the shattered screen of her phone, turning the volume all the way up. The small speaker crackled with a burst of static, followed by the ambient hum of hospital machinery. Then, a voice filled the quiet living room, crisp and undeniable. It was Eleanor. She was not speaking with the sorrowful, trembling tone she had used just 10 minutes ago to garner sympathy from the military wives. Her recorded voice held a cold, calculated edge, captured while she stood in the hospital hallway talking to her husband. "We cannot push him right now," the recorded voice of my mother-in-law whispered sharply. He is too stubborn, and the nurses are hovering. Just wait until after the funeral. She will be too broken to fight us on the paperwork, and we can get the house then. Elena pressed the screen again, cutting off the audio. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The guest did not merely murmur this time. They recoiled. A woman standing near the front row, a neighbor who had just offered Eleanor a sympathetic hug 20 minutes earlier, physically took 2 steps away from the matriarch. Another guest cast their eyes downward, entirely unable to look at the older couple. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. Hearing the words out loud, spoken with such casual cruelty while Adam lay dying just a few feet away from her, ignited a slow, burning fire behind my ribs. Eleanor had not acted out of sudden, overwhelming grief. She had actively plotted to use my darkest day as a tactical advantage, assuming my sorrow would render me defenseless. The matriarch scrambled to salvage whatever pieces of her reputation remained scattered on the floor. She pressed her black lace handkerchief against her mouth, forcing a fresh wave of tears into her eyes. People say terrible things when they are losing a child. Eleanor wept, her voice reaching a shrill, desperate pitch. She looked around the room, pleading with the disgusted faces of her friends. I was out of my mind with grief. I did not mean those words. I was just so terrified of losing my son, and I panicked. I did not yell, and I did not call her a liar. I simply took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us until I could see the fine lines around her panicked eyes. "Were you grieving when you hired the notary, Eleanor?" I asked gently. The question stripped away her defense entirely. Grief does not coordinate a fraudulent legal document, bribe a public official, and schedule a fake signing session in a coffee shop 3 towns over. Calculation does that. Grace Holloway reached into her leather briefcase again, refusing to give the older woman a single second to recover. The attorney pulled out a printed packet of paper, tapping the edges against the mahogany table to align them perfectly. "Since we are discussing your state of mind during this difficult time," Grace announced, her tone shifting from clinical to relentless, "we should also review the second audio file Colonel Whitaker preserved on his own phone." Charles bolted upright from his position near the staircase, his blotchy red face drained to a sickly gray. "You have no right to play private family conversations," my father-in-law shouted, taking a threatening step toward the table. This file was recorded on Colonel Whitaker's personal device in his hospital room after he specifically told Nurse Ramirez he wanted any pressure about the house documented. Grace corrected him smoothly. It was preserved in box number 7 with his written instruction that it be released only if you claimed the house after his death. The lawyer tapped the laptop. A burst of hospital static filled the living room. Then Eleanor's voice came through, low and sharp. "Do not worry about the deed," Eleanor said in the recording. "She was just an enlisted grunt when they met. She does not understand property law, and she will sign whatever we put in front of her to keep the peace." The room froze. Then Charles's voice answered, closer to the phone, rough with panic. "Make sure the paperwork looks official. I need the house listed before Friday or we are going to lose everything." The entire dynamic of the room shifted in an instant. The guests had been horrified by Eleanor's cruelty, but this new revelation introduced a completely different motive. This was not a misguided attempt to keep the family home and the Whitaker name out of some twisted sense of legacy or honor. This was a desperate cash grab. I looked at the older man standing by the stairs. Charles had spent the last decade lecturing me about financial responsibility, treating me like a naive child who did not understand how the real world functioned. Now, his own text message proved he was drowning in debt, entirely willing to steal a house from his widowed daughter-in-law to save his own skin. "Why did you need my house listed before your son was even buried in the ground?" I asked him, the coldness in my voice surprising even me. My father-in-law opened his mouth, searching for a commanding response, but nothing came out. He looked at the faces of his wealthy neighbors, the people he golfed with and drank expensive scotch with, and he saw the profound judgment in their eyes. The illusion of the successful, wealthy patriarch was completely destroyed. The pressure in the room became too much for him to bear. Charles broke eye contact, turning his back on the crowd. He pulled a vibrating cellular phone from his suit pocket, glanced at the caller identification, and his shoulders slumped. Without saying a single word to his weeping wife, the older man practically sprinted toward the sliding glass doors leading to the back porch. I watched him push the heavy glass open and step out into the crisp autumn air. The door did not close all the way, leaving a gap just wide enough for his panicked voice to drift back inside. "Mr. Dunleavy, please listen to me," Charles begged the person on the other end of the line, his tone frantic and completely devoid of pride. "I just need a few more days. The transfer got complicated, but everything is fine. No, please do not pull the term sheet. It is falling apart, Ray. Give me until Monday." Grace caught my eye, a silent communication passing between us. The attorney looked down at her own device, a small tablet resting next to her briefcase, as the screen illuminated with an incoming electronic mail notification. The lawyer tapped the screen, her eyes scanning the new message. A small, humorless smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Well, that explains the rush," Grace murmured. Her voice meant only for me, though the silence in the room allowed a few nearby guests to hear her. I stepped closer to the mahogany table. "What is it?" Grace turned the tablet toward me, displaying a message from her private investigator. The subject line glowed brightly against the white background. "My office just received a response from our financial inquiry," the attorney announced, raising her voice just enough to ensure Eleanor heard every word. "It seems your father-in-law did not just want to sell this property. 3 days before Adam's funeral, Charles Whitaker submitted the deed to your home as collateral for a high-risk loan with a private hard money lender." I stared at the screen, the magnitude of their betrayal settling over me like a heavy blanket. They had not merely planned to steal my home. They had already tried to spend the money. The sliding glass door rattled on its metal track as Charles pulled it shut, cutting off the crisp autumn breeze. My father-in-law stood on the edge of the Persian rug, his chest heaving under his expensive suit jacket. He shoved his cellular phone deep into his pocket, trying to smooth his expression into a mask of righteous indignation. The profound, heartbreaking grief that had anchored his face just 30 minutes ago was completely gone. In its place was the frantic, darting stare of a cornered animal desperately looking for an escape route. Charles Whitaker was not terrified of living in a world without his son. The older man was terrified of living in a world without money, and I could see the financial walls closing in on him right there in my living room. "What kind of nonsense are you fabricating now?" Charles demanded, forcing his voice into a booming baritone that echoed off the high ceiling. He marched over to stand beside his weeping wife, but he did not reach out to hold her hand. "You are hacking into private accounts, throwing around wild accusations about lenders. This is harassment, and I will not stand for it." Grace Holloway set her tablet down next to the military lockbox. The attorney did not look intimidated by the shouting man towering over her. She simply adjusted her reading glasses, projecting the calm, lethal patience of a professional who spent her entire career dismantling much smarter liars. "There is no hacking involved, Mr. Whitaker," the lawyer explained smoothly. "When a residential property enters a disputed legal status, standard protocol allows our investigative team to run a preliminary title inquiry. We need to ensure no unauthorized liens are being placed against the estate. What my investigator found was a draft term sheet from a private financial institution." A low wave of murmurs rippled through the 200 guests. The military wives and suburban neighbors leaned closer, practically holding their breath as they waited for the specifics of the scandal. "You do not have an approved mortgage from a traditional bank," Grace continued, breaking the situation down with brutal, humiliating clarity. "Traditional banks require a verified deed before they even process an application. Instead, you approached a hard money lender. That is a private entity that issues high-risk loans with exorbitant interest rates, typically used when the borrower cannot secure legitimate financing. Charles opened his mouth to shout another denial, but Grace cut him off by holding up a single, manicured finger. "You submitted a pre-approval request," the attorney stated, her voice carrying effortlessly across the crowded space. "On that official request, you listed this exact residential property as your expected collateral. You told the private lender that a family title transfer was pending, and you requested a massive cash advance based on the equity of my client's home." The older man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the tight collar of his white dress shirt. "Unfortunately for your financial timeline," Grace added, a sliver of absolute ice coating her words, "private lenders still run preliminary title searches before handing over cash. Their automated system checked the county records, saw that you do not hold any legal claim to this address, and instantly flagged your application for potential fraud." The crowd processed the weight of the word fraud, a heavy, dangerous accusation that hung over the coffee table like an executioner's blade. But I knew the most damning piece of evidence was still sitting in Grace's inbox, waiting to completely sever the alliance between my in-laws. "They did not just flag the file, did they?" I asked, stepping out from the shadow of the fireplace. The heavy, suffocating knot in my chest had dissolved entirely, replaced by a cold, sharp focus that sharpened every detail in the room. "No, they did not," the lawyer confirmed. She tapped the screen of her tablet, pulling up a secondary document provided by her investigator. "When the lender contacted you regarding the discrepancy on the title, you sent them an electronic mail response to reassure them. My investigator obtained confirmation from the lender's title department after they flagged the file for review." Eleanor stopped crying. The matriarch lowered her black lace handkerchief, staring at her husband with wide, panicked eyes. She clearly knew all about the forged deed and the fake notary, but this desperate loan application seemed to be a complete surprise to her. "Read the message," I instructed the attorney, refusing to take my eyes off Charles. Grace cleared her throat, holding the tablet up so the screen faced the crowd. The lender's internal note quotes the message Charles Whitaker sent on Wednesday afternoon. It reads, "The title transfer will be completed immediately after the funeral service. The widow will vacate the premises by the weekend, giving us full clearance to proceed with the collateral agreement." The words slammed into the room, aligning perfectly with the cruel audio recording Elena had played just minutes before. The coordinated viciousness of their timeline was now completely undeniable. Both of them had circled my darkest day on their calendars, waiting for the memorial service not out of respect for Adam, but because it served as the operational launch date for their theft. Eleanor turned toward the older man, her hands trembling violently. The unified front they had projected for 40 years at country club dinners and neighborhood parties shattered right there on my Persian rug. "You told them she would vacate by the weekend?" My mother-in-law hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You idiot. I told you we needed to handle her quietly. I told you to wait until I secured the signature on the deed." Charles snapped. The intense pressure of his collapsing scheme pushed him right over the edge, and he pointed a thick finger directly at his wife's face. "You said she would sign," he roared, completely ignoring the 200 witnesses watching their marriage self-destruct. "You promised me she was just a weak, stupid enlisted girl who would do whatever you told her to do. I have creditors calling my office every single morning, Eleanor. I needed that cash." The sheer ugliness of his confession knocked the breath out of me, but it also triggered a memory from the palliative care ward. A brief, seemingly innocent interaction that had confused me a month ago suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The hospital room smelled like industrial bleach and stale vanilla pudding. Adam was sleeping, the steady, rhythmic beep of his heart monitor filling the quiet space. Charles had stopped by for a rare visit, standing near the foot of the bed while actively avoiding looking at his son's pale, hollow face. My father-in-law had stared out the rain-streaked window, swirling a cup of terrible cafeteria coffee, and asked me a seemingly random question. He had asked what happens to the physical house if something unexpected occurs, masking his inquiry as deep paternal concern. I thought the older man was simply terrified of losing his child, spiraling into worst-case scenarios because grief makes people fixate on logistics. I had reached out, touching his arm, to comfort him, assuring him that everything was legally protected. He had not been seeking comfort. My father-in-law had been actively probing for weaknesses in our estate planning, measuring the walls of my home for a sale while his son was dying just 3 feet away. I looked at the man sweating in his expensive suit. The disgust rising in the back of my throat tasted metallic and bitter, burning like stomach acid. "Why did you need my house listed before your son was even buried in the ground?" I asked him. The volume of my voice was low, but the absolute fury behind the words made several guests standing near the staircase take a physical step backward. Charles opened his mouth, desperately searching the room for a friendly face, an ally, or a lifeline. He found nothing but cold, judgmental stares. The wealthy neighbors from his golf club were looking at him like he was a dangerous stranger. The military wives were glaring at him with open hostility, their arms crossed over their chests. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of being a successful, powerful patriarch, and now everyone in the living room knew he was just a desperate fraud drowning in debt. He could not formulate an answer, and his jaw worked silently as he stared at the floor. The silence stretched, heavy and complete, until a sudden commotion outside shattered the tension entirely. Flashing blue and red lights painted the front windows of the house, sweeping across the sheer curtains in frantic, rhythmic arcs. A heavy knock hammered against the front door, loud enough to rattle the wooden frame. Before anyone could move to answer it, the heavy oak door swung open, letting a blast of cold wind inside. A uniformed deputy from the county sheriff's department stepped into the entryway, resting his right hand casually near his utility belt. "Excuse me, folks," the deputy announced, his eyes sweeping over the massive crowd crammed into the living room. "I am looking for the homeowner. We received multiple dispatch calls from your neighbors regarding a disturbance and a street blockade." Charles seized the opportunity like a drowning man grabbing a piece of jagged driftwood. The older man spun around, his chest puffing out as he pointed his trembling finger directly at me. "Thank God you are here, officer," my father-in-law declared, his voice returning to its booming, authoritative register. "That woman is the homeowner, and she has completely lost her mind. She is using active-duty military personnel to threaten our family." The deputy blinked, his gaze shifting from Charles to the uniformed soldiers standing near the coffee table. Major Leah Morgan did not flinch, and she did not reach for her weapon. The officer simply maintained her parade rest stance, her expression carved from solid stone. "Sir, I just need to figure out what is going on with the logistics outside," the deputy said cautiously, navigating the tense, crowded room. "Some of your neighbors reported a massive military convoy blocking the residential thoroughfare, and we need to clear the street for emergency vehicles." Charles stepped closer to the law enforcement officer, adopting the smooth tone of a concerned, law-abiding citizen. He had lost the financial argument, his secret debt exposed for everyone to see, so he was pivoting to a completely new battlefield. He hoped to use the local authorities to punish me for his humiliation. "She brought 10 army trucks to my son's funeral," Charles lied, his voice dripping with manufactured outrage. "Ask her why she is using government resources and uniformed soldiers to terrorize civilians in their own home. She is completely out of control, officer, and you need to arrest her for abuse of power." The entire room shifted its attention back to me. Eleanor wiped her eyes, instantly realigning herself with her husband's new strategy. My in-laws were cornered, bleeding out socially and legally, but they were not going to go down without trying to drag my military career into the mud with them. The deputy remained perfectly still, his hand hovering near the radio on his shoulder while he surveyed the tense, crowded room. The silence felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on every person standing on the Persian rug. Charles stood tall, radiating a desperate, smug confidence, clearly believing he had finally found a weapon that could break me. "Officer," Major Leah Morgan said, her voice cutting through the anticipation with absolute military precision. She did not raise her volume, but the authority in her tone commanded the deputy's attention immediately. Leah stepped forward, her dress uniform immaculate, and retrieved a professional leather folio from her side. She handed the deputy the official convoy order, a document signed by the appropriate commanding officers and stamped with the Department of Defense seal. "I am Major Leah Morgan, commanding officer for this specific memorial and transfer mission," the officer stated. Her gaze locked firmly on the deputy's eyes. "I am responsible for the logistics and staging of all assets involved in this operation. We have been on site for less than 2 hours, and all vehicle placement has been coordinated with local county permits." The deputy took the document, his brow furrowing as he studied the complex logistical details. "This is not a rogue operation," Leah continued, pointing to the official vehicle manifest. "We are strictly following a pre-approved mission schedule regarding the delivery of medical supplies and the preservation of Colonel Adam Whitaker's estate records, as per the chain of custody documentation already in the possession of the estate attorney." Charles sputtered, his face turning an angry, blotchy shade of red. "She is lying. She brought these trucks here to intimidate us, to take over the house, and to prevent us from accessing our own property." The deputy did not look at Charles. He kept his eyes on the official convoy orders, slowly flipping through the pages as the major stood there, completely unfazed by my father-in-law's shouting. "Sir, this looks like a valid military transport order," the deputy said, finally turning his attention back to Charles. "Everything appears to be in order regarding the vehicle staging and the mission purpose. I was dispatched due to reports of a blockade, but the street is clear and emergency access is completely unobstructed." The disappointment on Charles's face was so profound, it almost felt like a physical victory. He had reached for the one card he thought would work, and the deputy had simply folded it back up and handed it to the major. "But you have to do something," Eleanor whined, her voice cracking as she moved closer to the law enforcement officer, trying to tap into the same pity she had used on the mourners earlier. "She is a lieutenant colonel, and she is using her rank to ruin our family. We are just grieving parents." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward Grace Holloway. The attorney stood there with her hands folded, looking at the older couple with the tired, weary expression of a woman who had seen this exact act 1,000 times before. "I have already reviewed the civil documentation regarding the property dispute," Grace said, her voice soft but authoritative. "There is a pending investigation into a fraudulent deed and potential mortgage fraud initiated by these individuals. My client is the legal owner of this home. Your attempts to force entry based on invalid paperwork constitute harassment, and I have already advised my client that if you do not leave the premises immediately, we will be seeking a formal restraining order." The deputy looked between us, his decision clearly made. He was a county officer, and he had no interest in becoming a secondary actor in a complex estate fraud investigation. "Look," the deputy said, addressing everyone in the room, "I am not going to involve myself in civil property disputes. However, if the owner of this house asks you to leave, you have to leave. If you refuse, I will be forced to escort you off the property for trespassing. Do I make myself clear?" Charles opened his mouth, his jaw working silently, but the look in the deputy's eyes warned him that his authority had evaporated. The older man turned, his shoulders slumping, and for the first time since the funeral began, he looked every bit of his 66 years. Eleanor followed him, her black lace handkerchief crushed into a ball in her hand, her face a mask of bitter, humiliated rage. They did not look back at the military wives, the neighbors, or the friends who had watched them tear their own lives apart in the span of an afternoon. As they walked toward the heavy oak door, my attention drifted to the small pile of personal belongings Charles had left on the side table near the entryway. Grace walked over to the table and picked up a heavy, cream-colored envelope that had fallen out of the manila folder during the shouting match. The attorney opened the flap, reading the contents with a sharp, calculating glint in her eyes. She pulled out a printed notification from the charity board, confirming that Eleanor was under immediate review for her role in the charity misappropriation scandal. "They were so arrogant," Grace whispered, tucking the envelope into her briefcase. "They really believed they could use Adam's death as a bank account, and they genuinely believed nobody would ever challenge them." I watched the front door click shut behind them, sealing away the noise and the anger. The house felt lighter, the oppressive energy finally beginning to bleed out of the high ceilings and the mahogany floorboards. "Is it really over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Leah walked over to the side table, resting a hand on the lid of the military lockbox that held the final pieces of Adam's truth. "It is just beginning, ma'am. We have successfully secured the chain of custody for the estate records, and your attorney has everything she needs to move forward with the civil filings. The hard money lender has already flagged their application, and the charity board has been notified of their suspension. The weight of the last few months, the hospital vigils, the grief, and the relentless pressure of their greed suddenly hit me all at once. I leaned against the back of a dining room chair, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. "I just wanted to bury him," I said, looking toward the window where the afternoon light was starting to fade. "I just wanted to say goodbye to my husband." "You did, ma'am," Leah said, her tone softening, "and you honored him by protecting the very thing he wanted to build." I turned back to the room, noticing for the first time that the guests had not left. They were still standing there, clustered together in small groups, whispering in low tones. Some of the military wives were walking toward me, their expressions somber but supportive. One woman, a major's wife I had known for years, squeezed my hand tightly. "We are so sorry we did not know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We should have seen what was happening." I shook my head, feeling a tear finally track through the makeup on my cheek. "You were not supposed to see. That was the point of their act." I looked down at the coffee table, at the remnants of their attempt to destroy my life. The forged deed lay there, invalid and meaningless, while the medical logs and the hard money lenders' inquiries formed a roadmap to their total ruin. Grace moved toward me, handing me a small sealed envelope that had been tucked away inside the military box. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Adam's. My fingers traced the letters on the front, the script a little shaky, a little tired, but still unmistakably his. I did not open it right then, deciding to save the final message for when the house was truly quiet, when the last guest had departed and the echo of his parents' shouting had finally faded. The deputy walked past me on his way out, giving me a respectful nod. "Take care of yourself, Lieutenant Colonel." I watched him step into the cool air, his cruiser's lights finally flickering off, leaving the driveway in relative darkness. The staging plan was working perfectly, the cargo trucks sitting in their assigned spots while the mission proceeded according to the approved schedule. I looked at Grace. "What happens on Monday?" The lawyer closed her briefcase, the sharp click of the latches resonating through the house. "On Monday, we file the formal request for the restraining order. We provide the medical records and the notary log mismatch to the civil authorities, and we let the system do exactly what it is designed to do." She walked over to the coffee table, gathered the forged papers, and placed them into a secure file. "They will be buried in legal discovery, Nora. They will be forced to answer every single question about those loans, about that notary, and about every cent they tried to take from this estate. They will not have a single dollar left to hire the kind of legal counsel they would need to fight this." I stood there in the center of my living room, the space that had been transformed into a battlefield, and felt a strange sense of clarity. The house was mine. The legacy was protected. And for the first time since the funeral started, I realized that I was not alone. I turned to the women standing near the fireplace, the military families who had stayed even after the yelling stopped. Thank you for staying. We are not going anywhere, the major's wife replied, looking around the room. This is your home, Nora. We are here to help you get it ready. I looked at the military lockbox, at the staging plan, and at the woman who had walked into my life and stood by my side when everything was falling apart. I walked over to the window, watching the last of the afternoon sun dip below the trees, and realized the house had finally begun to breathe again. The final piece of the puzzle remained in my hand. I walked into the kitchen, the space where I had spent so many mornings making coffee for Adam, and sat down at the small table where we had planned our future. I pulled the letter out of the envelope, the paper smelling faintly of the hospital ward, and unfolded the final words he had ever written to me. Adam's handwriting looked jagged, forced across the page, as if he had spent every ounce of his remaining strength just to keep the letters legible. I leaned into the kitchen light, my eyes tracing the ink that represented his final act of defiance. The note did not contain flowery declarations of love or long philosophical musings on life. Instead, it was a practical, clinical list of instructions, signed with a steady determination that brought a fresh wave of heat to my eyes. He had left me the contact information for the hospital administrator who had been on duty the night Eleanor tried to pressure him into signing the forged deed. There was a specific reference to a patient advocate named Sarah, a woman I remembered seeing in the hallway during my final week at the palliative care ward. According to Adam, she had witnessed Eleanor's behavior during the late evening of March 17th. My husband had spoken to her privately, ensuring her testimony was preserved in the event that his parents decided to weaponize his death against me. I folded the paper, clutching it against my chest like a shield. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table, vibrating against the wood with an urgent, rattling sound. Grace was calling, and she did not waste a single second with pleasantries. The board of the military charity just finished their emergency meeting, the attorney announced, her voice filled with a sharp, professional satisfaction. They saw the video of Eleanor's outburst in your living room. They heard the audio recording of her planning the house theft, and they had access to the full report on the attempted collateral fraud by Charles. She has been removed from the honorary chair position, effective immediately. I exhaled a long, shaky breath that felt like the first real inhale I had taken in months. What about the public memorial? She is officially barred from the podium, Grace replied. The board members are terrified of the association. They are scrubbing her name from the literature and the upcoming donor invitations. They do not want to be anywhere near the fraud investigation, and they certainly do not want her representing the organization's values. The phone clicked off, leaving me standing in the quiet kitchen. I looked around the house, seeing the structure for what it truly was. It was no longer a stage for my in-laws to perform their cruel, twisted version of family loyalty. It was becoming what Adam had wanted, a solid, permanent foundation for other families who were drowning. 2 days later, I stood inside the emergency board meeting, dressed in my formal service uniform. The room was cold, sterile, and filled with the scent of floor wax. Eleanor and Charles were sitting at the far end of a long mahogany table, their postures rigid and defiant. They clearly expected to walk in, manipulate the board, and regain control over the narrative of their son's legacy. Eleanor wore her signature black suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. She tried to smile at the board president, a man I had known for 5 years, but he refused to meet her eyes. "We are here to discuss the management of the Adam Whitaker Memorial," the board president stated, his voice devoid of his usual warmth. He did not ask Eleanor to start the presentation. He did not offer her a glass of water. But before we proceed, there is a formal request from the estate executor regarding the property status. I stood up, adjusting the medals on my jacket. I did not look at the older couple, focusing instead on the small, silver drive sitting on the table, the drive that held the truth about their greed. "I have presented the civil complaint, the fraud documentation, and the hospital records to the relevant investigative authorities," I told the room, my voice clear and unwavering. As of this morning, the transfer document presented by Eleanor Whitaker has been officially flagged as evidence in an active fraud investigation. Eleanor lunged up from her chair, her face turning a terrifying shade of pale. That is a lie. This is family business, not a legal matter. The board president raised his hand, effectively silencing her. Mrs. Whitaker, we have reviewed the evidence. You are no longer authorized to speak on behalf of this charity. Charles stared at his wife, then at me, his confidence completely obliterated. He knew the lender would never approve his loans now, and he knew he would never see a single cent from my home. The board members turned their chairs away from them, effectively freezing the couple out of the decision-making process. I watched them realize their power had vanished. They had spent their lives manipulating people with prestige and false kindness, and now they had nothing left but the wreckage of their own lies. As I walked out of the room, leaving them behind in the sterile silence, I knew they would never be allowed back into the home I had built with Adam. The truth had finally closed the door on them. The following weeks felt like walking through a house being systematically dismantled. Grace Holloway was relentless, moving through the legal system with a clinical efficiency that left my in-laws with nowhere to hide. Every morning brought a new update, a formal referral to the civil authorities, a notice from the county registrar voiding the fraudulent deed, or a devastating letter from the notary's oversight committee confirming that her license had been permanently revoked due to the discrepancies I had identified. I spent most of my time at the house, surrounded by the physical artifacts of Adam's life, transforming the living room into a staging area for the recovery house operations. The military trucks no longer blocked the street. Instead, local contractors moved quietly through the hallways, installing the accessibility ramps and medical-grade equipment we had planned for months. Eleanor and Charles had completely disappeared from my life, their absence leaving a silence in the neighborhood that felt both strange and profoundly liberating. Grace arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a thick binder that smelled of fresh toner. She sat at the kitchen table, her expression grave but satisfied, as she spread the documents out for my review. The civil complaint has been filed, and the authorities have officially requested statements from the hospital staff regarding the 17th of March, Grace said, tapping a document with the state seal. Charles is being squeezed by his lenders, and Eleanor is essentially a pariah in every social circle she once used to maintain her reputation. The lender withdrew the term sheet for the property collateral, and now the creditors are calling in his personal debts because they no longer believe he has any viable path to solvency. A cold sense of justice washed over me. They had bet their entire future on a woman they deemed too uneducated to defend herself, and they were now losing everything because of that specific, arrogant mistake. Is there any way they can crawl out of this? I asked, looking at the mountain of legal filings. Grace shook her head, a small, humorless smile touching her lips. They are looking at a protracted investigation for attempted mortgage fraud, civil liability for property theft, and the complete destruction of their financial standing. They cannot afford the kind of legal representation required to fight a case with this much forensic evidence. They have run out of money, they have run out of allies, and they have certainly run out of time. That evening, I stepped out onto the front porch to check the progress on the new signage. The old weathered plaque that once read Whitaker Residence had been removed, and the new elegant lettering for the Adam Whitaker Family Recovery House was already being prepped for installation. I looked down the street, my heart skipping a beat as a familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb. Eleanor stepped out, her movement stiff and ungraceful. She looked diminished, the expensive black suit she wore now hanging loosely on her frame. She walked up to the driveway, stopping right at the edge of the property line, her eyes fixed on the new plaque that had replaced her son's name. She did not rush toward me, and she did not try to force her way past the newly installed gate. She stood there in the fading twilight, holding a small, framed photograph of Adam against her chest. "You do not get to erase his mother," she said, her voice lacking its usual razor-sharp bite, sounding instead like a dry, brittle thing. I walked down the porch steps, stopping several feet away from her. I did not want her on my porch, and I certainly did not want her in my home, but the sight of her standing there, completely stripped of her power, served as a final, quiet punctuation mark to the last few months. "I am not erasing anything, Eleanor," I told her, my voice steady. "I am building something that Adam wanted, something you tried to sell for a profit while he was still struggling to breathe." She looked up at me, her eyes watery and haunted. For a split second, I saw a flicker of the mother who had raised the man I loved, but the image vanished behind the familiar mask of bitter, defensive resentment. "He was my son," she whispered, her grip on the photograph tightening until her knuckles turned white. "He was my husband," I countered, the finality of the statement hanging in the cool evening air. "And I am the one who kept his promise." She looked at the house one last time, turned around, and walked back to her sedan without another word. I stood there until the taillights faded into the distance, realizing that the house was no longer a monument to their pride or a vessel for their greed. It was finally, truly, a home. The morning of the grand opening arrived with a crisp, clear sky that mirrored the newfound sense of order inside the house. I stood in the living room, the space that had once felt like a battlefield, and found it nearly unrecognizable. The heavy, ornate furniture Eleanor had insisted on keeping in storage had been replaced by clean lines and functional design tailored specifically for the families who would soon be walking through these doors. I ran my hand over the plaque near the entrance, feeling the cool, polished brass under my fingers. Adam Whitaker Family Recovery House. It was not just a name or a project anymore. It was a breathing, working sanctuary for those who had been left behind by war, injury, and the quiet, devastating erosion of loss. A gentle knock at the front door pulled me away from my thoughts. I walked to the entryway, bracing myself for another confrontation, but it was only Major Leah Morgan. She wore her dress uniform, her presence, a steady, grounding force in the middle of a day that felt like a major milestone. "Everything is staged, ma'am," the major reported, her eyes scanning the room with a practiced, professional efficiency. "The support staff has arrived, the medical documentation is filed in the main office, and the first 3 families are expected to pull into the driveway in less than an hour." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with gratitude. "Thank you, Leah, for everything." Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The controversy that had gripped the street for weeks had long since dissipated into the mundane reality of daily life. I walked to the front window, keeping the sheer curtain pulled back just a fraction, and saw a sleek black sedan parked at the very edge of the property line. Eleanor sat behind the steering wheel, her silhouette a sharp, dark line against the morning light. She did not attempt to exit the vehicle, and she did not approach the gate. She simply watched the house, a silent observer of a future she had fought so desperately to prevent. I turned away from the window, refusing to grant her any more of my attention. She had lost the right to be a participant in this life, and I was not going to let her specter haunt the opening ceremony. Grace Holloway arrived shortly after, stepping out of her car with a thick file folder tucked under her arm. The attorney had been my shield through every legal skirmish, and her presence in the hallway felt like the final seal on the work we had done. "The civil complaint remains active, and Charles has missed the deadline for the preliminary response," Grace noted, dropping the file onto the hallway table with a satisfying thud. "The hard money lender has already initiated a formal foreclosure filing on his office building, given that he could not provide the collateral he promised them. The legal system is moving exactly as it should." I looked at the attorney, seeing the exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes. "He is losing his business?" "He is losing everything," Grace confirmed, her voice devoid of any lingering pity. The fraud referral regarding the notary and the forged deed is currently being reviewed by the district attorney's office. I expect to hear something by the end of the month regarding criminal proceedings." She walked over to the kitchen table, pulling out a chair where Adam and I had spent so many nights debating the future of this house. "They dug their own graves, Nora. You only held the shovel while they did the heavy lifting." I walked into the small memorial room I had established at the back of the house. It was a simple, quiet space filled with natural light, holding the few items that truly mattered. Adam's medals rested on a velvet cushion inside a glass case, and the folded flag from his funeral sat perfectly aligned beside them. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a warm blanket. For the first time, I did not feel the oppressive, watchful weight of the past. I felt the potential of the future. A car door slammed shut outside, followed by the sound of muffled voices and the scuffing of suitcases on the concrete driveway. I hurried back to the front entrance, my heart accelerating as I pulled the heavy oak door open. A young woman stood on the threshold, clutching the hand of a toddler, her face showing the raw, tired edges of someone who had been through a long, difficult ordeal. Beside her, a man stood with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, looking at the plaque on the wall with an expression of profound disbelief. "Are you the ones who run this place?" the woman asked, her voice trembling just a little. I opened the door wide, inviting the cool morning air into the hallway, and stepped aside to let them in. "I am Nora," I said, offering a genuine smile. "Welcome home." As I led them into the living room, I heard the engine of the black sedan turn over. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel was the last thing I heard from the driveway, and when I glanced back through the front window, the car was already pulling away, disappearing around the corner and leaving no trace behind. I closed the door, the heavy latch clicking firmly into place. The house was finally quiet, filled not with the echoes of cruel voices or the weight of stolen dreams, but with the soft, hopeful sound of new beginnings. I walked back toward the kitchen, my footsteps echoing against the floorboards I had once feared to walk on, and knew that I had kept every single promise I had made to the man who left me this sanctuary. The path forward was clear, and for the first time in a very long time, I was finally ready to walk it. You have watched how the truth eventually dismantled a house of cards built on greed, lies, and the arrogant assumption that silence equals weakness. When you stand in the center of your own life, facing those who would trade your dignity for their comfort, remember that you do not need to raise your voice to hold your ground. You only need to hold the truth clearly and consistently, and let the weight of it do the work for you. Standing your ground does not mean becoming a mirror for the cruelty you encounter. It means protecting your own boundaries so firmly that the toxicity can no longer find a place to land. You saw how the people who tried to steal my legacy were eventually undone by the very evidence they created, simply because they were too blinded by their own entitlement to realize that I was always paying attention. True strength is not found in the loudness of your reaction, but in the quiet precision of your defense. When someone tries to convince you that you are smaller than you are, or that you are dependent on their approval, hold tight to the facts of your own existence. It is easy to be swept away by the chaos of a confrontation, to let the gaslighting and the emotional manipulation pull you into a defensive spiral. But you must remain anchored in what you know to be real. You must understand that you are the only one who can validate your worth, and once you stop looking for it in the eyes of those who refuse to see you, you become untouchable. If you feel like you are standing in a house that someone else is trying to claim as their own, or if you feel the pressure of expectations that never belonged to you in the first place, know that it is within your power to change the locks. You have the authority to decide who gets to occupy the rooms of your life and who stays out on the curb. Do not be afraid to file your own formal records, whether they are legal documents or simply the internal set of boundaries you choose to enforce. There is a deep, resonant peace that comes from knowing you did not compromise your integrity to win a battle that should never have happened, and that you remained kind without being a doormat. You have watched me build a foundation from the rubble of a betrayal, not to spite those who failed me, but to create something that would actually matter. When you focus your energy on what you are building instead of what they are trying to break, you take the power out of their hands entirely. There is a unique kind of healing that happens when you stop fighting to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You deserve to live in a home that breathes with your own hopes, not one suffocated by the ghosts of other people's greed. So, take the inventory of your own life today. Look at the relationships, the debts, and the expectations that are currently taking up space without invitation. Ask yourself if you are still trying to earn a seat at a table where you were never meant to be welcomed. You have the right to set the table yourself, to invite those who respect the effort you have put into your own survival, and to close the door on anyone who thinks your accomplishments are merely a resource to be exploited. If you found yourself nodding as the truth finally broke the facade, I want you to tell me about your own sanctuary. What is the one thing you have been building in your life that no one else can take away from you, and how did you finally find the courage to protect it from those who did not value your worth? Perhaps you are currently standing in the hallway of a situation that needs a change of locks, or maybe you are just starting to realize that the person you have been relying on is actually the one holding you back. I want you to know that the clarity I found was not a miracle. It was a choice that I had to make every single day until the walls stopped shaking. What is the one truth you have been keeping in your own sealed box, waiting for the right moment to finally set it free?